They called him the Warrior King, the Black Dragon, the king who should have been. A bastard son who split a dynasty with a single sword, a prince so magnificent that half the 7 kingdoms would follow him into war against their rightful king. A man so dangerous that his very existence threatened to burn Westeros to ash. His name was Daemon Blackfyre, and his story is the greatest tragedy in the history of the Iron Throne. 1 sword, 1 rebellion. 5 wars spanning 64 years, tens of thousands dead, ancient houses destroyed, a realm torn apart by the question that still echoes through the ages: what makes a king? Blood or ability? Law or might? Imagine a warrior so skilled they compared him to legends. A prince so beloved that small folk and lords alike would die for him. A man given the sword of Aegon the Conqueror himself, the blade that united the 7 kingdoms. Now imagine that man was born a bastard, legitimized on a dying king's whim, and forced to watch as everything he believed was his birthright slipped through his fingers. This is not just a story of ambition. This is a story of destiny denied, of brothers killing brothers, of a legacy written in blood on a field so soaked in death they call it red grass. This is the story of how one man's dream became a nightmare that haunted Westeros for 3 generations. But here's what makes it truly haunting. What if he was right? What if the bastard truly was the rightful king? Before we dive deep into this epic tale, I need to tell you something. 84% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these deep dives into Westeros history, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps me bring you more stories like this. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our community spread across the globe, from King's Landing to your landing. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Settle into your blanket. Tonight we uncover the complete story of the warrior who almost destroyed a dynasty. Let's begin at the beginning, in the most corrupt court Westeros had ever seen. Our story begins in the late 170s after Aegon's conquest, during the reign of the worst king in Targaryen history, Aegon IV, called Aegon the Unworthy. And believe me, he earned that name. Picture the Red Keep in King's Landing during the most decadent, corrupt, and morally bankrupt era of Targaryen rule. King Aegon IV sat the Iron Throne like a grotesque spider, spinning webs of cruelty and chaos throughout the realm. He was fat, gluttonous, cruel, and took pleasure in humiliating everyone around him, especially his own family. His queen was his sister, Nyris, a gentle and pious woman trapped in a nightmare marriage. Aegon despised her fragility and made her life a living hell. Their son, Prince Daemon, was scholarly and thoughtful, everything a wise king should be. But Aegon looked at his bookish heir with contempt and spread vicious whispers throughout court that Daemon wasn't his son at all, but the bastard of Nyris and the legendary Aemon the Dragon Knight, Aegon's own brother. Whether this rumor was true or simply malicious slander, we may never know. But Aegon used it like a weapon, planting seeds of doubt about his own heir's legitimacy that would eventually tear the realm apart. But Aegon didn't just have one child. Oh no, he had dozens of bastards scattered across the 7 kingdoms, born from countless mistresses and affairs. These children became known as the Great Bastards, and 4 of them would shape the future of Westeros in ways no one could predict. There was Aegor Rivers, bitter and fierce, who would become Bittersteel. There was Brynden Rivers, pale and sinister, who would become Bloodraven. There was Shiera Seastar, beautiful and cunning, loved by both Bittersteel and Bloodraven, playing them against each other. And then there was Daemon. Born in the year 170, after conquest, Daemon was the son of King Aegon IV and his own sister wife, Princess Daenerys Targaryen. Yes, another incestuous union. But this one produced something remarkable. Princess Daenerys was considered one of the most beautiful women in the realm, and though she was married to her brother, their union was tragedy incarnate. She was trapped, like Queen Daenerys, in a marriage to a monster. But from that union came a boy who seemed to embody everything a Targaryen should be. They named him Daemon, after the rogue prince, and from his earliest days it was clear he was different. Tall, powerful, with silver gold hair that shimmered like molten metal and purple eyes, so dark they appeared almost black. He had the look of old Valyria stamped upon every feature. He moved like a predator, smiled like a prince, and commanded attention simply by existing. Growing up in the Red Keep alongside his half-brother Daemon, the contrast between them couldn't have been starker, and King Aegon made absolutely certain everyone noticed. Daemon Waters grew into manhood like a legend taking flesh. By the time he reached 15, he stood taller than most knights. His shoulders were broad, his movements graceful yet powerful, like a great cat stalking through the Red Keep's corridors. When he trained in the yard, courtiers would stop to watch. When he smiled, ladies would blush and turn away. When he spoke, men listened. Everything about him screamed Targaryen royalty. That silver gold hair caught the light like a crown itself. Those dark purple eyes held depths that seemed to see into your soul. His face was sharp and aristocratic, beautiful in the way the greatest Targaryen kings had been beautiful. He looked like the warrior himself had stepped down from the Seven's heaven to walk among mortals. And he could fight like it too. The masters-at-arms who trained him reported back to King Aegon with something close to awe in their voices. The boy was a natural. No, more than that, he was touched by something divine. Give him a sword, and he became poetry in motion. Put him on a horse, and he moved as one with the animal. In the training yard, grown knights twice his age found themselves struggling against him. By 16, Daemon was winning tournaments. By 18, he was legendary. Compare this to Prince Daemon, the true-born heir to the Iron Throne. Daemon was shorter, slighter, with the look of a scholar rather than a warrior. He preferred books to swords, diplomacy to warfare, quiet contemplation to loud glory. There was nothing wrong with Daemon. In fact, he was exactly the kind of thoughtful, intelligent ruler the realm needed. He was kind where his father was cruel. He was measured where his father was impulsive. He thought about the future, while his father only cared about his next pleasure. But when you put them side by side, the contrast was devastating. King Aegon made absolutely certain everyone saw that contrast. He would parade Daemon before the court, praising his martial prowess, his beauty, his commanding presence. He would shower the bastard with gifts and honors, while treating his legitimate heir with barely concealed contempt. In feasts, Daemon would sit near the king, while Daemon was placed further down the table. In councils, Aegon would ask Daemon's opinion on military matters, while dismissing Daemon's more thoughtful suggestions. The message was clear, even if unspoken. This is what a king should look like. This is what a king should be. The realm noticed. How could they not? Whispers spread through every castle, every tavern, every marketplace. Have you seen the king's bastard? He's what Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight must have been like in his youth. He's what a Targaryen king should be. Not like that weak Prince Daemon. Not like that bookish boy who might not even be the king's true son. Those whispers about Daemon's parentage grew louder every year. Perhaps Prince Daemon wasn't Aegon's son at all, but the child of Queen Daenerys and the great Aemon the Dragon Knight. Perhaps the true Targaryen heir was the bastard, not the prince. Perhaps everything was backwards and wrong. Aegon fed these whispers with malicious glee. He wanted chaos. He wanted confusion. He wanted to hurt his wife and his brother even from beyond the grave, and he found the perfect weapon to do it. Then came the year 182 after conquest, and Aegon did something that changed everything. He gave Daemon the sword. Not just any sword, Blackfyre, the Valyrian steel blade of Aegon the Conqueror himself. The sword that had united the Seven Kingdoms. The sword that had been passed from Targaryen king to Targaryen heir for nearly 2 centuries. The ultimate symbol of legitimacy, of right to rule, of Targaryen destiny made manifest in rippling dark steel. Aegon called Daemon before the entire court and presented him with Blackfyre. The bastard knelt, and the king placed the ancient blade in his hands. The message couldn't have been clearer if Aegon had crowned Daemon then and there. And what did Prince Daemon receive? Dark Sister, another Valyrian steel sword, but one without the same weight of history and legitimacy. It was like being given second place in a race you didn't know you were running. The humiliation was complete and public. From that moment, Daemon Waters became Daemon Blackfyre in all but legal name. The sword defined him. He wore it everywhere, trained with it daily, and it became as much a part of him as his silver hair or purple eyes. When people spoke of him now, they didn't say Daemon Waters the bastard, they said Daemon Blackfyre, and the name carried weight. The tournaments continued, and Daemon's legend grew with each victory. At the great tourney at Maidenpool, he unhorsed 12 knights in a single day. At River Run he won both the joust and the melee. Songs were written about his prowess. Singers compared him to Aemon the Dragon Knight, to Cregan Stark, to the greatest warriors in the history of the realm. And the people loved him for it. The small folk adored Daemon in a way they'd never loved scholarly Daeron. Here was a prince who looked like their storybook heroes. Here was a warrior who could protect them, who could lead them to glory, who embodied everything they dreamed a king should be. When Daemon rode through the streets, crowds gathered to cheer. When he fought in tournaments, the commons would chant his name until the nobility had no choice but to join in. This popularity wasn't accidental. Daemon had a gift for connecting with people. He would stop to speak with common soldiers. He remembered the names of servants in the Red Keep. He was generous with coin and praise. He made people feel seen and valued in a way that the distant bookish Daeron never could. Around this golden prince, a faction began to form. Lords who valued martial prowess over scholarship. Knights who dreamed of glory rather than peace. Ambitious younger sons who saw opportunity in chaos. Traditional houses who resented the changes they saw coming. Because Prince Daemon, for all his quiet intelligence, was already planning for his reign. And those plans included something that horrified many in the realm: Dawn. For 150 years, Dawn had been the enemy. Generations of Westerosi had fought and died trying to conquer the Desert Kingdom. The Dornish had killed dragons, murdered Targaryen princes, and remained stubbornly independent through sheer vicious determination. The hatred ran deep as roots and twice as bitter. But Daemon looked at this endless cycle of violence and saw waste. He saw 2 realms bleeding each other white over pride and old grudges. He saw a chance to accomplish through diplomacy what war had failed to achieve. He saw peace. The traditionalists saw betrayal. And when they looked for an alternative to the prince who would make peace with their ancient enemies, they found one tall, magnificent, wielding the conqueror's own sword, beloved by the commons and respected by warriors throughout the realm. They found Daemon Blackfyre. Not that Daemon was actively plotting, not yet. He was young, barely into his 20s, enjoying his fame and glory, but the pieces were being set on the board, the sides were choosing themselves. The stage was being prepared for a tragedy that would dwarf anything Westeros had seen since the Dance of the Dragons. And King Aegon the Unworthy watched it all with satisfaction, knowing the chaos he was creating would outlive him by decades. In the year 184, after conquest, King Aegon IV lay dying. His body, bloated by years of excess, was failing. His mind, still sharp and malicious to the end, worked on his final act of cruelty. The maesters gathered around his bed, knowing this was the end. The court held its breath. Prince Daemon prepared to take the throne that was rightfully his. Then Aegon the Unworthy destroyed everything. With his last breaths, surrounded by witnesses who would have to enforce his final decree, Aegon legitimized all of his bastard children, every single one, not just the great bastards, but dozens of others scattered across the 7 kingdoms. With a signature and a seal, he elevated them from baseborn to nobility, from bastards to princes and princesses. The wording was deliberately vague. Born of my body, true born in the eyes of gods and men. No mention of succession order, no clarification of rights or precedents. Just a blanket legitimization that threw the entire line of inheritance into chaos. Aegon knew exactly what he was doing. This was his masterpiece of malice, his final gift of destruction to the realm that would have to survive after him. He was creating multiple claimants to the throne, multiple princes who could argue they had just as much right as Daemon to sit the Iron Throne. He was lighting a fuse that would burn for decades. And the match he set to that fuse was Daemon. Daemon Waters became Daemon Blackfyre, not just in practice but in law. He was now Prince Daemon Blackfyre, a legitimate son of the king, carrying the conqueror's sword. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The implications were terrifying. Daemon took the throne as King Daemon II. The lords bent the knee, as they were supposed to. The succession appeared to go smoothly, but everything had changed. The question now hung over every conversation, every council meeting, every gathering of lords. If Daemon is legitimized, and if Daemon carries the sword of kings, and if Daemon might not even be Aegon's true son, then who really should be sitting the Iron Throne? Daemon himself seemed uncertain. He was in his mid-20s, popular and powerful, but he'd never actively sought the crown. The legitimization put him in an impossible position, too dangerous to ignore, too popular to eliminate, too proud to simply bow and accept a subordinate role to a half-brother he'd been raised alongside and possibly surpassed. What does a legitimized prince do when he carries the conqueror's sword, but his half-brother wears the conqueror's crown? King Daemon II was nothing like his father, and thank the gods for that. He was intelligent, measured, thoughtful. He understood that the realm needed healing after Aegon's disastrous reign. He knew that endless warfare had weakened the 7 kingdoms. He saw opportunities where others saw only tradition and grudges. And chief among those opportunities was Dorne. Daemon's great project was peace with Dorne, bringing the independent kingdom into the realm through marriage rather than conquest. His own mother, Queen Naris, had rumored Dornish sympathies if the whispers about Aemon the Dragon Knight were true. His sister Daenerys was married to the Prince of Dorne. His own son and heir, Prince Baisalor, called Breakspear, married Miriah Martell of Dorne. Through marriage and diplomacy, Daemon was accomplishing what 150 years of war had failed to achieve. Dorne was coming into the realm peacefully. The cycle of violence was ending. It was brilliant statecraft, and a huge portion of the realm absolutely hated it. These were houses whose fathers and grandfathers had fought the Dornish, knights who'd lost brothers to Dornish spears, lords who'd spent generations viewing Dorne as the eternal enemy. The wounds were too fresh, the hatred too deep. They saw Daemon's peace as betrayal, as weakness, as the corruption of true Westerosi values. The Dornish presence at court grew more prominent. Dornish customs influenced fashions. Dornish advisors whispered in the king's ear. To the traditionalists, it felt like an invasion by other means. They'd spent generations trying to conquer Dorne, and now Dorne was conquering them from within. They called Daemon the Dornishman's king, behind his back. They muttered about foreign influence, corrupting the throne. They complained that the king cared more for his Dornish wife's kin than for the lords who'd bled for his father. And when they voiced these complaints, their eyes would drift to Demon Blackfyre. Because Daemon represented everything they thought they'd lost. Pure Valyrian blood from both parents, that incestuous union of Aegon and his sister that was traditional Targaryen practice. No Dornish connections whatsoever, no foreign influence, just the old ways, the pure ways, the traditional Targaryen glory they remembered from songs and stories. Daemon became a symbol without even trying. He was the past made flesh, the alternative to everything Daemon represented. The warrior king versus the scholar king, the traditional versus the progressive, old Westeros versus new. The tension grew year by year. Daemon held estates away from King's Landing, and he spent more and more time there. Not quite exile, but definitely separation. The brothers couldn't exist comfortably in the same court anymore. Everyone could feel it. The realm was choosing sides even though no war had been declared. Lords would visit Daemon at his holdings, ostensibly for tournaments or hunting, but conversations would happen in private chambers. Promises would be made in whispers, gold would flow in secret. Alliances were forming like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Daemon's household grew in size and prestige. Knights of great renown joined his service. Younger sons seeking glory flocked to him. The greatest warriors in the realm wanted to be near him, to learn from him, to bask in his reflected glory. And there were his brothers, his half-brothers, all bastards like he'd been, now legitimized by that same deadly decree. Aegor Rivers, who took the name Bittersteel, attached himself to Daemon like a shadow. Bitter, fierce, an exceptional warrior in his own right. Aegor saw in Daemon everything he wanted to be. They trained together, fought together, planned together. Where Daemon went, Bittersteel followed. But there was another half-brother, and he chose the opposite path. Brynden Rivers, called Bloodraven for the red birthmark that covered half his face, became King Daeron's most valuable servant, pale, sinister, with one eye, and hair so light it was almost white. Bloodraven built a network of spies and informants that reached into every corner of the realm. He knew everything, trusted no one, and served Daeron with absolute loyalty. The two half-brothers, Bittersteel and Bloodraven, hated each other with a passion that went beyond politics. They'd both loved Shira Seastar, their beautiful half-sister, and she'd chosen Bloodraven. That personal hatred mixed with political opposition created something toxic and dangerous. Family civil war brewing within the greater conflict. 12 years passed this way. 12 years of tension, of choosing sides, of watching and waiting. 12 years of Daemon growing in power and popularity while Daeron consolidated his peaceful realm. 12 years of the realm holding its breath. And then, in the year 196 after conquest, the storm finally broke. Around the year 188 after conquest, Demon Blackfyre married. His bride was Rohan of Tyrosh, a noble woman from one of the free cities across the narrow sea. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a statement. Tyrosh was wealthy, powerful, and more importantly, it gave Daemon connections outside Westeros, access to sellsword companies, access to ships, access to resources that didn't depend on King Daeron's goodwill. The marriage was fruitful in every sense. Over the following years, Rohan gave Daemon 7 sons, 7 potential heirs, 7 young princes of Blackfyre blood, who would be raised in their father's image, trained to be warriors, taught to believe in their father's right to rule. The eldest 3 were named in traditional Targaryen fashion: Aegon, after the Conqueror; Aemon, after the Dragon Knight; Daemon, carrying his father's name forward. 4 more sons followed, each one adding to Daemon's growing dynasty. These weren't just children. They were a counter-dynasty, a parallel line of succession, living proof that Daemon wasn't just dreaming of glory for himself, but building something that would outlast him. While King Daemon had his heirs, Daemon had 7 sons who looked just like him, fought just like him, and believed in his cause with the fervor of youth. People started calling them the Redgrass 7, though that name would take on a much darker meaning later. Daemon's life developed a pattern in those years. He would spend some time at court in King's Landing, fulfilling his obligations as a prince of the blood, but increasingly, he found reasons to leave. His estates needed attention. Tournaments called him away. Business in the free cities required his presence. He wasn't in open rebellion, wasn't defying the king, but he also wasn't comfortable staying too close. The truth was that King's Landing had become unbearable for him. Everywhere he looked, he saw what he believed should be his, the throne, the crown, the power, and he saw it in the hands of a half-brother who in Daemon's view might not even have the right to it. His time in the free cities increased. He built relationships with the magisters of Tyrosh. He met with commanders of sellsword companies. He observed how the free cities conducted their politics and warfare, and he became increasingly aware that if war came, he could count on support from across the narrow sea. Back in Westeros, lords continued to visit him. Now they brought more than whispers. They brought promises. They brought pledges of support. They brought detailed discussions of who would declare for whom if it came to war. The theoretical was becoming practical. The possible was becoming probable. And the hatred between Bittersteel and Bloodraven reached a fever pitch. Agatha Rivers, called Bittersteel, was everything his name suggested: hard, unyielding, bitter to his core. He'd been born a bastard, legitimized but never fully accepted, and he burned with resentment at the world that had denied him what he saw as his birthright. He was a warrior of exceptional skill, a commander who understood warfare in his bones, and a man who believed absolutely in Daemon Blackfyre's right to rule. Bittersteel had additional reasons to hate Bloodraven beyond politics. The woman they both loved, their half-sister Shiera Seastar, had chosen Bloodraven over him. The rejection ate at Bittersteel like acid. Every time he saw Bloodraven, he saw the man who'd taken the woman he loved and who now served the king who sat on the throne that should belong to Daemon. Brynden Rivers, called Bloodraven, was equally dedicated to his chosen side, but in a completely different way. Where Bittersteel was all fire and fury, Bloodraven was ice and shadow. He built King Daemon's spy network into something terrifying. He had informants everywhere, in every castle, probably in Daemon's own household. He knew which lords were wavering, which knights were making promises, which whispers were turning into plots. Bloodraven was patient where Bittersteel was passionate. He understood that information was just as powerful as swords. He knew that preventing a war was better than winning one, and he worked tirelessly to keep King Daemon on the throne and to counter every move Daemon's faction made. The two half-brothers represented the two sides perfectly. Bittersteel was traditional warfare, honor, martial glory. Bloodraven was modern statecraft, intelligence, ruthless pragmatism. When they looked at each other, they saw everything they despised, and behind them stood Daemon and Daeron, two half-brothers who'd once played together as children and now couldn't exist in the same kingdom. Daemon's grievances crystallized during these years of separation. He'd been legitimized by the king's own decree. He carried the sword of Aegon the Conqueror, the ultimate symbol of Targaryen right to rule. He was the superior warrior, the more popular prince, the embodiment of everything the realm claimed to value. And yet he was expected to bend the knee to Daemon, who might be a bastard himself, who preferred books to battles, who was letting Dornish influence corrupt the realm, who represented everything Daemon believed was wrong with the current state of Westeros. Was it ambition? Absolutely. Daemon wanted the throne. He believed he deserved it. He'd been groomed for it by his father. Even if unofficially, the sword in his hand whispered that it belonged on the hip of a king. But it was more than naked ambition. Daemon genuinely believed he was right. He looked at Daemon's peaceful policies and saw weakness. He looked at the Dornish influence and saw corruption of traditional values. He looked at the doubts about Daemon's parentage and saw illegitimacy. He convinced himself that the realm needed him, that he would be a better king, that it was his duty to claim what was rightfully his. By the year 196 after conquest, everyone knew war was coming. The only question was when and how it would start. Lords were stockpiling weapons. Knights were taking sides. The realm was holding its breath, waiting for someone to make the first move. Daemon was 36 years old, in the absolute prime of his life. His sons were growing into young men. His support base was solid. His resources were gathered. Bittersteel whispered that the time was right, that they'd never have a better chance, that waiting only gave Bloodraven more time to undermine them. Across the realm, in King's Landing, Daemon knew it too. His spies reported everything. He knew which lords had pledged to Daemon. He knew about the sellswords being hired in Essos. He knew about the weapons being stockpiled. He tried diplomacy, tried to diffuse the tension, but some forces once set in motion can't be stopped. The die was cast 12 years earlier, when Aegon the Unworthy legitimized his bastards. Everything since then had been inevitable momentum toward this moment. In 196, Daemon Blackfyre raised his banner, the black dragon on a field of red, the inverse of the Targaryen sigil, a statement that he was Targaryen but different, legitimate but opposed, the alternative that half the realm had been waiting for. He declared himself King Daemon, the first Blackfyre, and the realm erupted into flames. When Daemon Blackfyre raised his banner and declared himself king, the realm didn't gasp in shock, it exhaled in relief. Finally, the tension that had been building for 12 years could break. Finally, the sides that had been choosing themselves in whispers could declare openly. Finally, the question that had haunted every conversation since Aegon the Unworthy's death would be answered in blood and steel. Who was the true king? The response was immediate and devastating. Within weeks, nearly half the lords of Westeros declared for the Black Dragon. Not a few malcontents or ambitious troublemakers. Half the realm. This wasn't a minor uprising. This was civil war on a scale Westeros hadn't seen since the Dance of the Dragons over a century before. The Reach split almost down the middle. House Tyrell, the Warden, stayed loyal to King Daemon. But House Peak, one of the most powerful families in the region, declared for Daemon and brought dozens of lesser houses with them. House Ball, House Caswell, lords who commanded thousands of swords, all raised the Black Dragon banner. The Riverlands fragmented along old feuds and new ambitions. House Bracken, ancient enemies of House Blackwood, declared for Daemon. Where Bracken went, their supporters followed. House Blackwood stayed loyal to Daemon, and suddenly the Riverlands was a patchwork of hostile territories, with armies marching in every direction. The Westerlands saw houses Rain and Crakehall, wealthy and powerful, throw their support behind Daemon. The gold of Casterly Rock stayed with the Lannisters and King Daemon, but enough Western lords rebelled to make the region a battleground. The Stormlands tore themselves apart. Brothers chose different sides. Houses that had fought together for generations now prepared to fight each other. Every castle became a potential fortress for one side or the other. Only the North and the Vale stayed largely unified in their loyalty to King Daemon. Their lords were more isolated from southern politics, less concerned with Dornish influence, more focused on their own regional concerns. They sent support south but mostly watched the realm burn itself from a distance. And Dorne? Dorne, united completely behind Daemon. This was personal for them. Daemon represented everything that wanted to drag Westeros back to the old days of endless war with the Desert Kingdom. His supporters openly called Daemon the Dornishmen's king as an insult. The Martells knew that if Daemon won, the peace would die and the killing would start again. Prince Marin Martell mobilized 30,000 Dornish spears and prepared to march north. This time, Dorne would fight not as conquerors but as defenders of the realm's peace. Daemon's supporters weren't just nameless lords. These were legendary figures in their own right. Lord Quentyn Bol, called Fireball for his red-hot temper and the blazing sigil of his house, was perhaps the finest knight in the Seven Kingdoms after Daemon himself. He'd served the Kingsguard before Aegon the Unworthy dismissed him, and he'd never forgiven the Targaryens for that humiliation. Now he served Daemon as his foremost general, commanding respect from every warrior in the realm. Bittersteel, Aegar Rivers, served as Daemon's right hand and master of cavalry. He was steel in human form, unbending and unbreaking, absolutely devoted to Daemon's cause. Where Daemon inspired love, Bittersteel inspired fear and respect. Together they made a formidable partnership. House Peak provided not just military might, but also political legitimacy. The Peaks were an ancient house that claimed descent from the Age of Heroes. Their support lent weight to Daemon's claim, suggesting this wasn't just a bastard's ambition, but the realm's nobility choosing the better king. Across the narrow sea, sellsword companies hired with Taroshi gold prepared to sail for Westeros. The Korhoric warriors, the Taroshi crossbowmen, mercenaries from all over Essos who'd heard of Daemon's legendary prowess and wanted to fight under his banner. Money flowed like wine, and where gold went, swords followed. Why did so many support a legitimized bastard over their lawful king? The reasons were as varied as the men who chose sides. Some genuinely believed Daemon would be the better ruler. They looked at his martial prowess and saw the strength the realm needed. They looked at his charisma and saw a leader men would follow into the seven hells themselves. Others opposed Daemon's policies on principle. The Dornish alliance stuck in their throats like poison. Generations of their families had fought Dorne. Their fathers and grandfathers had bled trying to conquer the Desert Kingdom. Now their king was inviting Dornish influence into the highest levels of power. It felt like betrayal, like their ancestors' sacrifices meant nothing. The whispers about Daemon's parentage swayed others. If Daemon truly was the bastard of Queen Nerys and Aemon the Dragon Knight, then he had no right to the throne. Better a legitimized bastard who everyone knew was Aegon's son than a possible bastard pretending to be legitimate. Younger sons saw opportunity in chaos. In peacetime they'd inherit nothing and accomplish less. In war they could win glory, lands, titles. Daemon's cause attracted the ambitious and the desperate in equal measure. And some supported Daemon simply because they loved him. The small folk especially saw in him the hero from their stories, tall, beautiful, strong, kind to those beneath him. He was what a king should be in their hearts and minds. When Daemon rode through villages, people would weep and reach out to touch him. They called him blessings. They named their children after him. King Daemon's advantages were equally significant. He had the law on his side. Every oath sworn was sworn to him. Every tradition and precedent supported his claim. He was the eldest son of the previous king, legitimately born, properly crowned. To oppose him was treason, pure and simple. The crown's treasury gave him resources Daemon couldn't match. He could hire his own sellswords, feed larger armies, sustain a longer war. The bureaucracy of the realm worked for him. The tax collectors, the port authorities, the trade networks all answered to King's Landing. Dorne's support was crucial. 30,000 spears might not sound like much, but these were Dornish spears. Warriors who'd made the Seven Kingdoms bleed for 150 years. Fighters who knew how to win against larger forces through cunning and ruthlessness. Prince Marin brought not just numbers but tactical brilliance and absolute commitment. And Daemon had Blood Raven. Brynden Rivers had spent 12 years building a spy network that reached into every corner of Westeros. He knew which lords were wavering before they knew it themselves. He intercepted messages, turned informants, planted rumors. His pale face and blood-red birthmark became symbols of terror for Daemon's supporters. Blood Raven sees all. Blood Raven knows all. Cross the king, and Blood Raven will find you. His personal guard, the Raven's Teeth, were expert archers recruited from throughout the realm. 1,000 men who could shoot the eye out of a sparrow at 100 paces. They wore dark cloaks and darker reputations. When they appeared on a battlefield, men whispered prayers. But Daemon's greatest advantage was also his greatest weakness. He was the better administrator, the wiser ruler, the more thoughtful strategist, but he wasn't the better warrior. When it came to personal combat, to leading men in battle, to inspiring through sheer martial prowess, Daemon was supreme. The early campaigns went Daemon's way. His armies moved fast and struck hard. Castles that might have resisted found themselves facing Daemon himself at the gates, and something in them broke. How do you deny a prince who looks like that, who carries that sword, who speaks to you with such conviction? One by one, strongholds opened their gates. Some after brief sieges, others without any resistance at all. The Black Dragon banner spread across the Reach and Riverlands like a shadow. Fireball commanded the vanguard and won every engagement. His tactical brilliance combined with the raw enthusiasm of Daemon's supporters created a momentum that seemed unstoppable. Loyalist forces found themselves outmaneuvered, outfought, and demoralized. King Daemon's armies struggled initially. They were well supplied but less motivated. Their commanders were competent but not inspired. They followed orders but didn't have the passion that drove Daemon's men forward. Fighting for law and tradition doesn't set hearts on fire the way fighting for a legendary warrior king does. But both sides knew this couldn't continue. Raiding and maneuvering would only get you so far. Eventually, the armies would have to meet in a decisive battle. Everything would be settled in a single day of blood and iron. Both commanders began moving their forces toward a confrontation. Daemon pushed south. Daemon's loyalists marched to meet him. The Dornish army moved north to join the main royalist force. Scouts brought reports back to both camps. The armies were approaching each other. Within days, maybe weeks, they would clash. The realm held its breath. Every castle, every village, every hamlet waited to see which dragon would triumph. The red or the black, the scholar or the warrior, the king by law or the king by right. By late in the year 196 after conquest, both armies were in the Reach, that fertile heartland of Westeros, where the grass grew thick and green. It was good farming country, peaceful and prosperous. It was about to become a graveyard. They met on a field south of the Trident, where the grass grew so thick it brushed the bellies of horses. Later they would call it the red-grassed field, not for the color of the grass before the battle, but for the color it turned during. Both armies arrived within hours of each other, as if fate itself had arranged the meeting. Daemon's forces came from the west, banners streaming in the wind, the black dragon rippling on fields of red. Daemon's loyalists approached from the east, the traditional Targaryen red dragon on black visible for miles. The commanders assessed the ground. The field was relatively flat, good for cavalry charges. A few gentle rises, but nothing that would give either side a significant advantage. Some scattered trees, but mostly open ground. This would be a battle of pure force meeting force, with little room for clever tactics or ambushes. Daemon's army numbered somewhere between 15 and 18,000 men. Exact counts are difficult because chroniclers on both sides had reasons to inflate or deflate numbers, but it was a massive host by any standard. knights in plate armor, men at arms in mail, levies with spears and crude weapons. The wealthiest army a rebel force had ever assembled. Bittersteel commanded the cavalry, several thousand mounted warriors ready to charge on command. These were the cream of Westerosi knighthood, men who'd trained their entire lives for this moment, horses bred for war, armor polished to mirrors, lances that could punch through plate. Daemon himself would lead the center, surrounded by his household knights and his personal guard. His sons would fight beside him. Aegon and Aemon, his twin boys barely into manhood but already formidable warriors trained by their father. Daemon the younger, carrying his father's name and determined to prove worthy of it. Fireball commanded the vanguard, the first troops who would smash into the enemy lines. His banner showed the flaming ball of his house, and his reputation alone was worth 1,000 swords. When Quentyn Ball charged, brave men felt fear. The Tyroshi crossbowmen took positions on the flanks, professionals who killed for pay and did it efficiently. They didn't care which dragon won, only that their employer paid them, and Daemon's gold spent as well as anyone's. King Daemon's army was similar in size, perhaps slightly larger, depending on which account you trust. The difference was that these men fought for the legal king, backed by the full resources of the crown, better supplied, better fed, their weapons and armor maintained by royal armories. Bloodraven commanded the archers, and his raven's teeth took position on a slight rise that gave them excellent sight lines across the field. 1,000 expert bowmen who could put arrows through gaps in armor, through eye slits in helms, through the joints where plate segments met. Bloodraven himself stood among them, pale as death, one eye scanning the field with inhuman intensity. Prince Moran Martell led the Dornish forces, 30,000 spears that had marched north to defend the peace. They'd force-marched for weeks to reach this field, and they were tired but determined. The Dornish fought differently than traditional Westerosi knights. They were lighter, faster, more flexible. They understood that battles weren't won by glory charges, but by killing the enemy efficiently. Lord Hayford commanded the main battle, the center that would have to hold against Daemon's assault. He was competent, experienced, loyal, not a legendary warrior, but a solid commander who understood his role. The night before the battle, both camps prepared in their own ways. In Daemon's camp, the mood was almost festive. They'd been winning, they had momentum. They had the greatest warrior in the realm leading them. Victory seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Men sharpened weapons and told stories of the glory they'd win tomorrow. They sang songs about Daemon Blackfyre, about the sword he carried, about the dynasty they would found. At dawn, Daemon knighted his 3 eldest sons in a ceremony that brought tears to hardened warriors' eyes. He used the sword Blackfyre to tap each boy on the shoulders. Aegon, Aemon, Daemon the younger, rise as knights. The boys glowed with pride and determination. They would fight beside their father today. They would prove themselves worthy of their blood. Across the field, Daemon's camp was quieter, more somber. These men knew they fought for law and duty rather than glory and love. They knew half the realm supported the enemy. They knew they faced perhaps the greatest warrior alive. But they also knew they were right. The law was clear, oaths were sacred. Treason was treason no matter how beautiful its face. Bloodraven didn't sleep. He walked through the camp, checking positions, speaking to commanders, making final adjustments to the plan. His mind worked like a machine, calculating angles and possibilities. He knew Daemon would be dangerous. He knew Fireball's reputation. He knew this battle could go either way. But he also knew that if they could kill the right men at the right moment, the entire rebel army would collapse. Dawn broke clear and bright, the kind of beautiful morning that made you grateful to be alive. Within hours, 10,000 men would be dead, and the grass would be red. Both armies formed up. Banners unfurled in the morning breeze. Horses stamped and snorted. Men checked their weapons one final time, tightened straps on armor, muttered prayers to whatever gods they believed in. Daemon sat his horse at the front of his army, visible to every man on the field. He wore plate armor, enameled in black and red, the colors of his house. The sword Blackfyre hung at his side, its Valyrian steel blade, darker than normal steel, rippled with patterns that seemed to move in the light. His sons flanked him, looking like younger versions of their magnificent father. When Daemon raised his sword, a cheer erupted from his army that must have been heard for miles. 20,000 throats roaring their love and loyalty for the Black Dragon. The ground itself seemed to shake. Across the field, Daemon's forces raised their own cheer, but it was different, determined rather than passionate, duty rather than love, but no less real for that. The battle began with Fireball's charge. Lord Quentyn Ball led the vanguard forward at a trot that quickly accelerated to a gallop. Hundreds of knights on war horses thundering across the field, lances lowered, a wall of steel and horseflesh, and death bearing down on the loyalist lines. The impact was catastrophic. Lances punched through shields and armor, horses trampled men who fell. The sound of it was like thunder, like the world breaking. The loyalist front line buckled under the assault, men dying in droves, the formation beginning to collapse. Fireball was in the thick of it, his sword rising and falling, each stroke ending a life. He fought like a man possessed, like the fire of his name made flesh. He carved through the enemy with brutal efficiency. But then he fell. Some say an arrow found a gap in his armor. Others claim a spear caught him from an unexpected angle. However it happened, Lord Quentyn Ball went down in the first minutes of the battle. The legendary knight, one of the finest warriors in the realm, dead before the sun had fully risen. His death sent shock through Daemon's vanguard, but it also enraged them. They pressed forward with renewed fury, determined to avenge their fallen commander. The loyalist lines bent further, threatening to break completely. Daemon saw the crisis developing. This was the moment. If he pressed the advantage now, if he led his household knights in a charge to support the vanguard, the enemy center would shatter. The battle would be won by midday. He spurred his horse forward, and his sons followed. Hundreds of his best knights charged with him, a second wave crashing into loyalist forces, already reeling from Fireball's assault. And Daemon was magnificent. Everything the songs said about him, everything the legends claimed, all of it was true in that moment. He was the warrior himself descended to the mortal plane. Blackfyre sang in his hands, the Valyrian steel cutting through armor like parchment. Men fell before him like wheat before a scythe. He punched through the first line. Through the second, his sons fought beside him, with desperate courage, determined to match their father's prowess. The household knights followed, and together they created a wedge that drove deep into the heart of Daemon's army. Witnesses later said they'd never seen anything like it. Daemon Blackfyre, at the height of his power, the greatest warrior of his generation, proving why half the realm had followed him. He was unstoppable. He was inevitable. He was victory made manifest. The loyalist center began to collapse. Men were falling back, some routing entirely. Prince Maren's Dornish forces tried to shore up the line, but even they were being pushed back by the sheer momentum of Daemon's charge. It looked like the Black Dragon would win. It looked like Daemon Blackfyre would prove that might made right, that the greatest warrior deserved to be king. From his position on the rise, Bloodraven watched it all with his single eye. He saw Daemon's breakthrough. He saw the loyalist lines buckling. He saw victory slipping away. And he made a choice that would echo through history. Bloodraven's voice cut through the chaos of battle like a blade. The raven's teeth responded instantly. 1,000 bowstrings drew back as one. 1,000 arrows knocked. The archers adjusted their aim. targeting not the mass of struggling soldiers, but a single point deep in the enemy formation, where the black and red armor gleamed in the sunlight, where the legendary sword rose and fell, where Daemon Blackfyre fought at the absolute pinnacle of human capability. Bloodraven gave the order. The arrows flew. They fell like steel rain, not scattered across the battlefield but concentrated into one killing zone. Dozens of arrows, then hundreds, all targeted at Daemon and the knights surrounding him. Daemon was so far into enemy lines that his own forces couldn't protect him. He'd broken through with such power that he'd isolated himself in a pocket of enemy soldiers. The very momentum that made him victorious now made him vulnerable. The first volley killed horses and knights around him. Men who'd followed Daemon into the breach fell with arrows through throats and eyes and the gaps in their armor. The protective shell around him began to thin. Daemon kept fighting. An arrow glanced off his shoulder plate. Another stuck in his horse's armor, but didn't penetrate. He was still moving, still killing, still driving forward. The second volley came. More arrows, more death. Daemon's horse screamed and went down, an arrow through its neck. He rolled clear, came up on his feet, Blackfyre still in hand. Even dismounted and surrounded, he was dangerous. His sons saw their father fall from his horse. Aegon and Aemon, the twins who'd been knighted just that morning, spurred their horses forward. They had to reach him. They had to protect him. Nothing else mattered. They never made it. The same arrows that targeted Daemon found his sons. Aemon took an arrow through the eye slit of his helmet and died instantly. Aegon fell seconds later, multiple shafts piercing his armor. The twin dragons died within sight of their father, their blood mixing in the trampled grass. Daemon the younger, the third son, charged in from another angle. He fought through the enemy with his father's courage, if not his skill. He actually reached the king, got within a dozen yards. Then the arrows found him too. He went down hard, his horse collapsing on top of him. He died there, crushed and pierced, calling for his father with his last breath. Daemon saw them fall. All three of his sons, the boys he'd knighted at dawn, dead in the span of minutes. Something broke in him then. Not his courage or his skill, but something deeper. The future he'd been fighting for, the dynasty he'd tried to build, dying in front of his eyes. But he kept fighting because that's what warriors do. Surrounded, dismounted, his sons dead around him, Daemon Blackfyre refused to yield. The third volley of arrows came. They said it took 3 arrows to bring him down, though some accounts claim more. One caught him in the neck, punching through the gap between helm and gorget. Another slammed into his chest, finding a weak point in the plate. A third, or maybe it was the fourth, went through his thigh. Daemon Blackfyre fell to his knees. The sword Blackfyre, the blade of Aegon the Conqueror, slipped from his fingers and clattered to the bloody ground. The black dragon was down. The king who should have been was dying. The greatest warrior of his generation bled out in the mud at age 36. Some say Bloodraven shot the killing arrow himself. Others claim it was 3 different archers whose shots all found their mark. The truth probably died with the men who were there, but it doesn't really matter who loosed the string. The order came from Bloodraven. The kill belongs to him. Across the battlefield, word spread like wildfire. Daemon is down. The black dragon has fallen. The king is dead. Daemon's army, which moments before had been on the verge of victory, suddenly faced a crisis of faith. They weren't just fighting for a cause anymore. They were fighting for a man, and that man was lying in the dirt with arrows through his body. The loyalist forces sensed the change immediately. They pressed forward with renewed energy. What had been a desperate defense became a counterattack. Bitter Steel saw it all from where he commanded the cavalry. He saw Daemon fall, He saw the sons die. He saw the army beginning to waver, and he made an impossible choice. He had to save what could be saved. He had to preserve something of this disaster for another day. He led his cavalry in a desperate charge, not to press the attack, but to cover a retreat. He fought through to where Daemon had fallen, scattering enemy soldiers through sheer fury and skill. He dropped from his horse and grabbed the sword Blackfyre from where it lay beside Daemon's corpse. The blade felt impossibly heavy in his hands, heavier than steel alone could account for. It carried the weight of everything they'd lost. Daemon's remaining sons, the 4 who hadn't fought in the battle, were somewhere in the camp behind the lines. Bittersteel sent his most trusted knights to find them, to get them away, to preserve the bloodline for whatever future might exist. Then he fought his way back out, rallying what forces he could, organizing a retreat that quickly became a rout. The Loyalist army pressed their advantage. What had been a battle became a massacre. Daemon's soldiers, their hearts broken by their king's death, fled in every direction. The disciplined retreat Bittersteel tried to organize fell apart into panic. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Others surrendered on the spot. Some tried to fight their way clear and died in the attempt. The field became a killing ground, Loyalist forces pursuing and cutting down fleeing rebels. Prince Maren's Dornish warriors were particularly efficient at this grim work. They'd spent generations learning how to kill Westerosi knights. Now they applied those hard-learned lessons without mercy. Dornish spears found backs and legs and necks. Men who'd called Daron the Dornishman's king as an insult died with Dornish steel in their guts. The streams that crossed the field ran red, literally red. So much blood flowed into them that the water turned crimson. Men trying to flee across these streams slipped on blood-slicked rocks and drowned in water tainted with the dying. By nightfall, the red grass field earned its name. The grass that had been green that morning was trampled flat and soaked through with blood. 10,000 men or more lay dead or dying. The flower of Westerosi chivalry, the finest warriors from a dozen kingdoms cut down in a single day. Daemon Blackfyre lay among them. The Maesters later recovered his body and treated it with respect despite the rebellion. King Daemon, to his credit, showed mercy to his rival's corpse. Daemon was laid out in state, his wounds cleaned, his armor repaired. He looked in death as magnificent as he'd been in life. Beside him lay his 3 sons, Aegon, Aemon, Daemon, the younger, the twins who'd died trying to save their father. The 3rd boy, who'd almost reached him, cut down before their lives truly began, victims of their father's ambition and their own filial loyalty. The bodies were returned to Daemon's widow, Rohan of Tyresh. She'd lost a husband and 3 sons in one afternoon. The remaining 4 boys, spared only because they hadn't fought, would be taken into exile by Bittersteel. The Black Dragon's line continued, but at what cost? House Bracken lost dozens of knights. House Peak lost hundreds of men at arms. House Ball lost their lord and many of his household. Ancient families with histories stretching back centuries found themselves decimated in a single day. And over it all, the sword Blackfyre was gone. Bittersteel had taken it across the narrow sea, along with Daemon's surviving sons and what remained of the rebel leadership. The blade that started it all, the symbol of legitimacy and destiny, now carried in exile. The Loyalists counted their own dead. As the sun set, Lord Hayford had held the center, but at enormous cost. The Dornish had lost hundreds. Even victory came with a butcher's bill that would take years to pay. Bloodraven walked the field as darkness fell. His archers had done their work efficiently and brutally. 3,000 arrows or more had fallen on that one point where Daemon fought. The ground there was thick with shafts, a forest of death grown in an afternoon. He found where Daemon had fallen. The grass was matted with dried blood. Scraps of black and red armor littered the ground. The earth itself seemed traumatized by the violence that had occurred here. Bloodraven felt no triumph, only grim satisfaction that duty had been done. He'd preserved King Daemon's throne. He'd ended the rebellion. But the cost weighed on him like chains. The field lay quiet under the stars. The screaming had stopped. The dying had mostly finished their business. Only the crows remained, circling overhead, waiting for the living to leave so they could feast. They called it the Red Grass Field, 10,000 dead in a single day. The greatest battle since the Dance of the Dragons, the day the Black Dragon fell and took half the realm's dreams with him. And yet, somehow, it wasn't over. Bitter Steel lived. Daemon's sons lived. The sword Blackfyre survived, carried in exile. The first Blackfyre rebellion had ended. But as Bloodraven stood in that field of death, he knew with cold certainty that it wouldn't be the last. The ghost of Daemon Blackfyre would haunt Westeros for generations to come. The aftermath of the Red Grass Field was measured in executions and exiles. King Daemon II faced an impossible decision. Half the realm had just rebelled against him. Thousands of lords and knights had committed treason. If he executed them all, he'd depopulate entire regions. If he pardoned them all, he'd look weak and invite another rebellion within years. So he chose the middle path. Some of the leaders were executed publicly as examples. Lord Gorman Peake lost his head for his role in organizing the rebellion. Other prominent lords who'd been especially vocal in their support of Daemon met similar fates. The executions were meant to satisfy justice without becoming wholesale slaughter. But many were pardoned. Lesser lords who'd followed their overlords into rebellion. Knights who could claim they were simply honoring their oaths to their direct superiors. Soldiers who'd had no real choice in which side they fought for. Daemon understood that healing the realm meant showing mercy where possible. The great houses that had supported Daemon faced different punishments. House Bracken lost lands and influence but survived. House Peake was stripped of most of their holdings, reduced from one of the great powers of the Reach to a shadow of their former glory. House Ball was extinguished entirely with the death of Fireball and his heirs. Bloodraven led the pacification campaign with ruthless efficiency. His spy network had documented every conversation, every promise, every whispered word of support for the Black Dragon. Now he used that information to root out anyone who might cause trouble in the future. It wasn't enough to have fought for Daemon. If you'd thought about fighting for him, if you'd spoken favorably of him, Bloodraven knew. His methods earned him a reputation that would last centuries. People whispered that he had 1,000 eyes, and one that he could see through the eyes of ravens, that he knew your thoughts before you thought them. The terror he inspired kept the realm quiet, but it also made him one of the most hated men in Westeros. While Daemon and Bloodraven secured the realm, Bittersteel fled across the narrow sea with what remained of Daemon's cause. He brought the 4 surviving sons of Daemon Blackfyre, Hagon, Aedence, and 2 others whose names history barely remembers. Young boys who'd lost their father, and 3 brothers in a single afternoon. Bittersteel also brought the sword. Blackfyre itself, the Blade of Kings now carried in exile. It became the symbol of everything they'd lost, and everything they still fought for. And he brought hundreds of exiled knights and soldiers, men who'd fought for the Black Dragon and could never go home. Warriors who'd lost everything but still believed in the cause. They were bitter, displaced, dangerous. In the year 212, after conquest, 16 years after the Red Grass Field, Bittersteel founded the Golden Company. It started as a sellsword company, like any other exiled Westerosi who needed employment, found it in the free cities. They sold their swords to the highest bidder, fought in the endless squabbles between Tyros and Lys and Mai. They earned reputations as excellent soldiers, disciplined and skilled. But the Golden Company was never just mercenaries. They were exiles dreaming of home. Every man who joined them was given a simple promise. Someday we will return to Westeros. Someday we will restore the Blackfyres to the throne. Someday we will go home. Their motto captured this perfectly. Beneath the gold, the bitter steel. On the surface they were mercenaries motivated by coin, but underneath beat hearts of iron, devoted to a cause that seemed increasingly hopeless with every passing year. Bitter steel trained Daemon's sons personally. He taught them to fight with the same intensity their father had possessed. He told them stories of Daemon's glory, of his prowess, of how close they'd come to victory. He kept the flame of rebellion alive through sheer force of will and bitterness. Because Aegor Rivers was aptly named, he was bitter to his core, bitter about his bastard birth, bitter about losing Shiera Seastar to Bloodraven, bitter about the defeat at Red Grass Field, bitter about exile. That bitterness never softened, never faded. It sustained him through decades of waiting and planning. By 211 after conquest, 15 years after Redgrass Field, the time seemed right for another attempt. Daemon's son Haegon was now an adult. The realm had had time to forget the horror of civil war and remember only the glory of Daemon's legend. Lords who'd been children during the First Rebellion were now men with their own grievances against King Daemon. And some houses never forgiven their losses. House Peak especially burned with resentment. They'd been one of the great powers of the Reach before the rebellion. Now they were diminished, their lands stripped, their pride in tatters. Lord Gorman Peak, grandson of the executed lord, wanted revenge more than he wanted breath. The conspiracy formed slowly. Secret messages crossed the narrow sea. Gold changed hands in dark corners. Promises were made in whispers. A plan took shape. They would coordinate a rising in Westeros with an invasion from Essos. The Golden Company would provide the military force. Daemon's sons would provide the royal bloodline. Disaffected lords in Westeros would provide the support base. It couldn't fail. Except Bloodraven knew everything. His network of spies and informants had penetrated every level of the conspiracy. He read the coded messages before their intended recipients. He knew which lords were wavering, which knights were making promises, which merchants were moving gold for the rebels. He knew the entire plan in exquisite detail. And he let it develop. He wanted to catch everyone at once, to identify every single person involved so thoroughly that another rebellion would be impossible for generations. The conspirators planned to gather at White Walls, a castle in the Riverlands, for a tournament. It would be the perfect cover. Lords from across the realm attending a jousting competition. Nothing suspicious about that, except hundreds of them would be there to coordinate the rebellion. The tournament began. Lords arrived from every corner of Westeros. Tents spread across the fields. Jousts were held. Feasts were served. Everything seemed normal. Then Bloodraven arrived with a royal army. The shock was complete. Bloodraven had known about the tournament all along. He'd known about the conspiracy, about the invasion fleet preparing in Essos, about every detail, and he'd waited until everyone was gathered in one place before springing his trap. Mass arrests followed. Lord Gorman Peak was taken into custody. Dozens of other lords found themselves in chains. The tournament ground became a prison camp overnight. The Second Blackfyre Rebellion was crushed before it properly began. The invasion fleet from Essos arrived to find no rising in Westeros waiting to support them. Worse, they found a royal navy prepared and waiting. The Golden Company's ships were destroyed or scattered, men drowned by the hundreds. The survivors limped back to Essos in defeat. Daemon's son, the one called Daemon II, had died young before the rebellion began. It was Haegon leading the cause now, but it didn't matter. Without support in Westeros, without the element of surprise, the whole plan collapsed. Lord Peake was executed. Many others lost their heads. House Peake was exiled entirely, forbidden from ever holding lands in Westeros again. They would join the Golden Company in permanent exile, nursing their grudges across the narrow sea. The Second Blackfyre Rebellion was over before it truly started. Bloodraven's reputation grew even more fearsome. How could you plot against a man who knew your plans before you finalized them? But 8 years later, they tried again. The Third Blackfyre Rebellion in 219 after conquest was different. They'd learned from past failures. This time, they didn't rely on conspiracies in Westeros. They simply invaded with the full strength of the Golden Company. Daemon III led them, called Daemon the Handsome, because he'd inherited his grandfather's legendary looks. Tall, silver-haired, purple-eyed, charismatic. He looked like the first Daemon reborn. Men who'd followed his grandfather now followed his grandson with the same devotion. The Golden Company landed on Westerosi shores for the first time since their founding. 12,000 experienced soldiers, veterans of countless battles in Essos. They weren't fighting for gold now. They were fighting to go home. And initially, it worked. They established beachheads. They won early skirmishes against local forces. Several castles in the Reach declared for the Black Dragon. For a few weeks, it seemed possible that Daemon III might succeed where his grandfather failed. But then the full weight of the realm fell on them. King Aerys I, Daemon's successor, sent his brother Prince Marka with a massive army. The same Prince Marka who would later become king himself, a warrior of considerable skill and experience. The campaign lasted weeks. Real battles, real bloodshed. The Golden Company proving why they were considered the best sellswords in the world. But they were 12,000 against a kingdom of millions. They were cut off from resupply. They were fighting in hostile territory where every peasant might report their movements. The decisive battle came in the Reach. Daemon III led his men with his grandfather's courage. The Golden Company fought with the desperation of men who knew this might be their only chance to return home. They lost. Prince Marka's forces, larger and better supplied, ground them down through sheer weight of numbers. The Golden Company broke and scattered. Daemon III was captured in the retreat, pulled from his horse by loyalist knights. They brought him to King's Landing in chains. Daemon the Handsome, grandson of the great Daemon Blackfyre, paraded through the streets like a common criminal. The small folk who'd loved his grandfather jeered at the grandson. He was executed for treason, beheaded in the courtyard of the Red Keep. His body was returned to the Golden Company with a message: this is what happens to rebels. This is what happens to those who challenge the throne. Bittersteel escaped again. Somehow, impossibly, the old warrior survived yet another defeat. He gathered what remained of the Golden Company and retreated to Essos once more. The sword Blackfyre went with him. Daemon's remaining descendants went with him. And they would try again, because that's what the Golden Company did. That's what Bittersteel had built them for. They failed, regrouped, and tried again. Each rebellion crushed, each Daemon killed or driven into deeper exile, but the cause never died. 3 rebellions down, 2 more to go, and Westeros was already exhausted by the cycle of violence. 17 years passed before the 4th Blackfyre Rebellion, the year 236. After conquest found Westeros under the rule of King Aegon V, called Aegon the Unlikely because he'd never expected to be king. He was a good man, a thoughtful ruler who cared about the small folk. His reign brought needed reforms and relative peace. But the Blackfyre cause didn't care about good kings or peaceful reigns. It had become something beyond politics, beyond reason. It was a legacy, a destiny that had to be fulfilled, no matter the cost. House Peak, still exiled in Essos, still nursing their ancient grudges, orchestrated the fourth rebellion. They proclaimed another Daemon, the fourth to bear that cursed name, as the rightful king. Daemon the Fourth, grandson of Daemon the Third, great-grandson of Daemon the First. The bloodline continuing, each generation raised in exile, taught to believe the throne was theirs by right. The rebellion was smaller than the others. House Peak couldn't muster the same resources. The Golden Company was exhausted from previous failures. Most importantly, Westeros had no appetite for another civil war. The lords who might have supported earlier rebellions were dead or too wise to repeat their father's mistakes. It became known as the Peak Uprising, rather than a proper rebellion, limited to certain areas of the Reach, more of an insurrection than a kingdom-wide civil war. King Aegon's forces suppressed it quickly and efficiently. Daemon IV disappeared from history. Some accounts say he was killed in battle. Others suggest he fled back to Essos. A few whisper that he never existed at all, that House Peak simply proclaimed a figurehead to rally support. The truth died with the men who were there. House Peak was finally definitively ended, not just exiled but extinguished. Their remaining members were hunted down, their lineage erased. They'd gambled everything on the Blackfyre, caused 4 times over 6 decades, and lost everything. The Golden Company remained in Essos, but their sacred mission seemed increasingly futile. They were still the finest sellsword company in the world. They still never broke a contract. But the dream of returning home to restore the Blackfyres felt more distant with each passing year. Bitter Steel had died by then, after decades of bitter exile, after 4 failed rebellions, after watching 3 generations of Daemon Blackfyres die for a lost cause. Aegor Rivers finally succumbed to age. He died sometime around 240, after conquest, still in exile, never having achieved his dream of seeing a Blackfyre on the Iron Throne. His final wish was granted in a way that captured the Golden Company's strange mixture of pragmatism and devotion. They gilded his skull, covered it in gold, and placed it in a place of honor. Every captain of the Golden Company since then has carried Bittersteel's skull into battle, their founder watching over them, judging them, demanding they never forget their purpose. Beneath the gold, the bitter steel, even in death, Aegor Rivers remained what he'd always been. The Golden Company continued without him, but something had changed. The original purpose, restoring the Blackfyres, was fading into legend even for them. New generations joined who'd never seen Westeros, who'd been born in Essos, lived in Essos, knew nothing but the sellsword life. They fought brilliantly, earned fortunes, built reputations, but the dream of home became abstract. Then came the War of the Ninepenny Kings. The year 260 after conquest, 24 years after the Fourth Rebellion, 64 years after Daemon I fell at Redgrass Field. The world had changed dramatically since then. New kings sat thrones, new houses had risen, old grudges had faded. But one last male-line Blackfyre remained, and he was a monster. Maelys the Monstrous was his name, and he earned it. He was huge, powerful, brutal. Most famously, he had a vestigial second head growing from his neck, a malformed twin absorbed in the womb, but never fully integrated, leaving a growth with what some claimed was a half-formed face. Whether this was medical fact or propaganda doesn't matter. What matters is that Maelys was terrifying to behold. And he was cruel, in ways his ancestors had never been. Daemon I had been beloved. Daemon III had been handsome and charismatic. Maelys was neither. He killed his own cousin to secure his position as the last male Blackfyre claimant. He ruled through fear and violence. But he had ambition to match his monstrosity. He looked at the Golden Company and saw an opportunity. He looked at the fractured politics of Essos and saw allies to be gathered. He looked at Westeros and saw a throne waiting to be taken. Males formed an alliance called the Band of Nine, 9 rulers, warlords, and adventurers who each had their own kingdoms to conquer, their own scores to settle. Males would take Westeros. The others would carve up their own territories. They'd support each other's ambitions until everyone got what they wanted. It was an alliance built on greed and ambition, held together by the Golden Company's military might. Meleys crowned himself king of Westeros in exile and prepared to make it reality. They invaded the Stepstones first, those rocky islands between Essos and Westeros, strategically vital for controlling trade routes. The Band of Nine took them surprisingly quickly, establishing fortress bases, preparing for the invasion of the mainland. Westeros responded. King Jaehaerys II, Aegon the Unlikely Son, mobilized armies. The threat was real. Maleys had the Golden Company, the Band of Nine's resources, and the Stepstones as a staging ground. If they reached the mainland in force, it could spiral into another devastating civil war. The campaign lasted months. Brutal fighting across the Stepstones' rocky terrain. The Golden Company proved why they'd survived for nearly 50 years. They'd learned from every previous failure. They fought with discipline and skill that far exceeded the royalist forces' expectations. Meleys himself was a terror on the battlefield. His size and strength were legendary. He wielded a massive war axe that could split a man in two. His deformed appearance made him nightmarish to face in combat. Men who survived fighting him spoke in whispers about the Monster King. But Westeros sent its finest warriors, young knights seeking glory, veterans seeking to end the Blackfyre threat permanently. And among them was a man who would become the greatest knight of his age. Sir Barristan Selmy, barely into his 20s, but already showing the skill that would make him a legend. He'd earned his knighthood through valor in previous battles. Now he would earn immortality. The armies clashed in a decisive battle. Thousands fighting across rocky ground, ships burning in the harbors, men dying with the taste of salt in their mouths. The Golden Company held their ground against superior numbers through sheer professionalism. Meleys led from the front, his massive bulk cutting through enemy formations. He seemed unstoppable, unkillable, a force of nature rather than a man. Then Barristan Selmy challenged him to single combat. The details have become legend, probably embellished over decades of retelling, but the core facts remain. Barristan faced Meleys one-on-one, while armies watched. The young knight against the monstrous king, skill against strength, the future against the past. It should have been no contest. Mace was bigger, stronger, more experienced. His axe had killed dozens. His reputation alone made brave men falter. But Barristan was faster, smarter. He didn't try to match strength with strength. He used his speed, his technique, his courage. He dodged the massive axe strikes that would have killed him instantly. He found openings in Mace's defense. He cut and stabbed and refused to back down. The fight lasted what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Both men wounded, both bleeding, both refusing to yield. Then Barristan's sword found Meleys' throat. The giant fell. The monstrous king died. The last male line, Blackfyre, ended with blood gurgling from his mouth. The Golden Company saw their king fall. Their sacred cause, their reason for existence, died with him. Meleys had no sons, no brothers, no Meleys to carry the Blackfyre name. 64 years after Daemon I raised his banner, 5 rebellions, tens of thousands dead, ancient houses destroyed, all for a cause that ended with a young knight's sword through a monster's throat. The Band of Nine collapsed without Meleys. The other warlords made their own peace deals or fled. The Golden Company surrendered, the first and only time they'd ever broken. Their contract was with Meleys, and Melis was dead. The surviving members returned to Essos. They still had their company, their reputation, their gilded skull of bitter steel. But their sacred mission was over. There were no more male Blackfyres to restore. The sword Blackfyre remained in their possession, but it was just a sword now, not a symbol of destiny. The Blackfyre rebellions were finally definitively over. 5 wars across 64 years, 5 failures, 5 Daemons, trying to claim what the first Daemon had believed was his right. And it accomplished nothing. The Targaryens still ruled. The realm had survived. All the death, all the destruction, all the dreams had led nowhere. Or had they? Because even though the male line ended, the legacy remained. The Golden Company endured. The sword survived. And in Westeros, people still told stories about the Black Dragon, the king who should have been, the warrior so magnificent that half the realm would follow him against their lawful king. Some causes die. Some causes transform into something else. And some causes never truly end, no matter how many times they fail. After the death of Melis the Monstrous, the Golden Company faced an identity crisis that would define their future for generations. They'd been founded with a single sacred purpose: restore the Blackfyres to the Iron Throne, return home to Westeros in glory. Everything else, every contract they took, every battle they fought, was just means to that end. They were exiles waiting to stop being exiles. Now that purpose was impossible, the male Blackfyre line was extinct. There was no king to restore, no cause to fight for. They were just sellswords, and Essos had dozens of sellsword companies. But the Golden Company didn't dissolve. They didn't fade into obscurity or merge with other companies. Instead, they became something unique in the world of professional soldiers. They became exiles who accepted their exile, but never forgot what they'd lost. Their motto remained the same: beneath the gold, the bitter steel. The gold represented their mercenary nature, their willingness to fight for coin like any other company. The bitter steel represented their true character, forged by loss and exile, and a cause that failed 5 times over 6 decades. They maintained traditions that set them apart. Every captain still carried bitter steel's gilded skull into battle. New recruits learned the history of the Blackfyre rebellions, not as strategy lessons, but as sacred texts. They could recite the names of commanders who fell at Redgrass Field. They knew which houses had supported which Daemon. The past wasn't just remembered, it was honored. And they maintained the one thing that made them truly special among sellswords: their perfect record. The Golden Company never broke a contract. Ever. In a world where sellswords were famous for switching sides when offered better pay, for abandoning employers in crisis, for betraying trust, the Golden Company was absolutely reliable. If you hired them, they fought for you until the contract was fulfilled or until they were all dead. No exceptions. Well, one exception. They maintained that if a Blackfyre, or someone with a legitimate claim to restore them to Westeros called, the Golden Company would break any contract to answer. It was written into their charter, agreed to by every member, accepted by every employer who hired them. Everyone knew the Golden Company had one loyalty above all others, even if that loyalty could never be called upon now. This reliability made them the most expensive and most sought-after sellsword company in Essos. Free cities fought over the right to hire them. Merchant princes paid fortunes for their service. Disputed successions were decided by which side the Golden Company fought for. They were 10,000 strong at their peak. Though the number fluctuated, all heavy cavalry, the pride of Westerosi military tradition, knights and men-at-arms equipped with the best armor that money could buy, fighting techniques passed down from the original exiles, continuously refined through constant warfare. But they remained distinctly Westerosi in character. Sons followed fathers into the company, creating military dynasties that stretched back to the original exiles after Redgrass Field. They spoke the common tongue of Westeros rather than the various languages of Essos. They worshipped the Seven or the old gods rather than the strange deities of the free cities. They were a piece of Westeros existing in permanent exile, a military ghost of a lost cause that refused to dissipate. Back in Westeros, Daemon Blackfyre's cultural impact far outlived the rebellions that bore his name. Among the small folk, he became a romantic figure. Songs were written about the Black Dragon, not dwelling on the wars he started or the thousands who died, but on his legendary prowess and tragic fate. He was the warrior king who should have been, the prince too noble for a corrupt world, the hero killed by treachery rather than defeated in fair combat. Singers would perform ballads about Daemon at harvest festivals and feast days, the warrior with the sword of kings, the Black Dragon's fall, the last charge, at Redgrass Field. Each song painted him as more legend than man, conveniently forgetting the civil war and focusing on his undeniable charisma and skill. The common people loved these stories because Daemon represented something they could believe in, a king who looked like their storybook heroes, a warrior who would protect them, a prince who smiled at small folk and remembered their names. Compared to the distant, scholarly Daemon, or the increasingly erratic kings that followed, Daemon seemed like what a king should be. This created a cultural undercurrent that lasted for generations. Anytime a weak king sat the throne, people would mutter about how things would be different if Daemon had won. Anytime the realm faced crisis, old men would claim that the Black Dragon would have handled it better. He became a measuring stick against which all subsequent rulers were compared, usually unfavorably. For the nobility, the legacy was more complex and painful. The great houses that had supported Daemon were destroyed or permanently weakened. House Peak went from regional power to extinct. House Bracken never recovered their former status. House Rain was diminished, though they'd last another century before their own destruction for different reasons. Families were permanently torn apart by the choice of which dragon to follow. Brothers had killed brothers at Redgrass Field. Fathers had executed sons for choosing the wrong side. These wounds never fully healed. For generations afterward, certain houses wouldn't intermarry because their grandfathers had fought on opposite sides of the rebellion. The question of which side your house supported became part of noble identity. It was documented in histories, remembered in family traditions, occasionally thrown as insults during heated arguments in court. The Blackfyre rebellions created fault lines in Westerosi nobility that persisted long after the cause itself died. The sword Blackfyre remained in the Golden Company's possession, though its fate became uncertain after Meleys died. Some accounts claim it was lost. Others say it remained with the company, waiting for a claimant who would never come. The ambiguity itself became part of the legend, because that sword represented something beyond its physical existence. It was the idea that legitimacy could be transferred, that being given the Conqueror's blade meant something fundamental about your right to rule. Aegon the Unworthy had used it as a weapon against his own son, and that weapon had killed thousands long after both men were dust. The Blackfyre rebellions fundamentally weakened the Targaryen dynasty in ways that wouldn't become apparent for generations. They proved that Targaryens could be challenged. They showed that legitimacy was negotiable, that oaths could be broken, that even dragons could bleed. When Robert's rebellion came nearly a century later, when another great warrior challenged a Targaryen king, the precedent had been set. Daemon had almost succeeded. Robert did succeed. The path from one to the other was straight and clear. More immediately, the rebellions consumed resources that could have been used elsewhere. The Targaryen dragons were already gone by Daemon's time, died out in the Dance of the Dragons. But the rebellions prevented the dynasty from adapting to rule without them. Instead of building new foundations of power, They spent 64 years fighting over which prince should sit the throne. Bloodraven's spy network, necessary to counter the Blackfyre threat, created a culture of paranoia and mistrust. When everyone might be a rebel sympathizer, when your own cousins might plot against you, trust becomes impossible. The Targaryen court became a place of whispers and daggers, suspicion and betrayal. And it accomplished what? Melee's the monstrous dead on a beach. The Golden Company broken. The cause ended. But the dynasty so weakened that a generation later, a Baratheon would tear it down. In the Free Cities, the Golden Company became part of local politics in ways that still echo today. They were kingmakers, the deciding factor in countless succession disputes. They enriched themselves through 40 years of continuous employment while maintaining their distinctly Westerosi character. Mercenary companies usually integrate with their environment. Eventually, members marry locally, adopt local customs, become part of the region, not the Golden Company. They stayed separate, stayed Westerosi, maintained the fiction that someday they might go home, even though that day grew more distant with every passing year. Some historians whisper that the company never truly abandoned their original mission, that they waited, patient as stone, for an opportunity to fulfill their oath, that when chaos came to Westeros, when the Targaryens fell, when the realm was torn by war, the Golden Company would return. Whether these whispers have any truth depends on which accounts you believe. Some say the company leadership maintains connections with surviving Blackfyre descendants through the female line. Others claim they've moved beyond their origins and are simply excellent soldiers. A few suggest they're pawns in larger games, waiting to be used by ambitious schemers who don't care about ancient causes. But everyone agrees on one thing. The Golden Company endures. Bitter Steel's skull still leads them into battle. They still never break contracts. They still remember the Black Dragon and the fields where their founders bled. And somewhere in their possession, possibly lost or possibly hidden, lies the sword Blackfyre, waiting, as it's always been waiting since the day Aegon the Unworthy placed it in his bastard son's hands and set the realm on fire. Section 12. The Warrior King's Legacy. So here we are, 64 years after Daemon Blackfyre raised his banner, 5 rebellions, all failures, tens of thousands dead, and for what? Let's strip away the songs and look at who Daemon really was. Everything they said about his martial prowess was true. He genuinely was one of the greatest warriors Westeros had ever seen. His charisma wasn't manufactured. People loved him. The small folk would weep when he rode past. But he was also ambitious, proud, willing to plunge the realm into civil war for what he believed was his right. Was he a victim of Aegon the Unworthy's manipulation? Absolutely. But Daemon made his own choices. He raised that banner. He started that war. The tragedy is that he was everything and nothing he believed himself to be. A true Targaryen prince who died with arrows in his back at 36, watching his sons fall around him. Was he right to claim the throne? That's the question that divided the realm. Legally, he had arguments. He was legitimized. The sword Blackfyre gave him symbolic weight. The whispers about Darren's parentage complicated everything. But Darren was the acknowledged heir, raised as crown prince, crowned and anointed. Legitimization doesn't change birth order. Both sides had legitimate arguments. That's why half the realm followed Daemon. The question wasn't black and white, but 1,000 shades of gray. And that ambiguity killed 10,000 men at Redgrass Field. The cost was devastating. 10,000 dead at Redgrass in one afternoon. 4 more rebellions over 64 years. 20, 30, maybe 50,000 dead total across 3 generations. Ancient houses destroyed, families permanently torn apart. And for what? The Targaryens still ruled after all 5 rebellions. The throne never changed hands. The dynasty Daemon tried to found died with melees on a beach. Nothing was accomplished except suffering. But the long-term damage might be worse. The rebellions proved Targaryens could be challenged. They consumed resources the dynasty needed to adapt after losing their dragons. Bloodraven's spy network created a culture of paranoia. The great houses were permanently divided. Most damningly, the rebellions accomplished Aegon the Unworthy's goal. He wanted chaos that would outlive him. His legitimization of the bastards weakened House Targaryen more than any external enemy ever managed. The what-ifs are endless and pointless, but historians love them. What if Aegon never gave the sword? What if Daemon had won at Redgrass? Would he have been a better king? Probably not. He was a warrior, not a statesman. The Dornish peace would have ended. More wars, more deaths. Here's what we can learn. Ambiguous succession is deadly. Symbols carry enormous weight in monarchy. Charisma isn't enough to make a good king, and civil war is never ever worth it. The romantic songs hide 10,000 corpses rotting in a field. The echoes reached the present. Jon Snow, another bastard with royal blood. Vijayan, possibly a Blackfyre pretender backed by the Golden Company. The Targaryens kept tearing themselves apart over succession. Daemon's rebellion was just one chapter in that story. The Golden Company still exists, still carrying Bittersteel's skull, finally returning to Westeros after 3 centuries. The dream transformed but never died. So what's the final assessment? Daemon was the greatest warrior of his generation, genuinely beloved, had legitimate grievances, but he started a war that killed thousands. 5 attempts across 3 generations, all failures, every death for nothing. That's his true legacy, not the sword or the rebellions. His legacy is the question he forced Westeros to answer. What makes a king? Birth or ability? Law or might? Westeros chose law over ability. That choice cost dearly. But if they'd chosen differently, the cost might have been higher. Daemon Blackfyre died 300 years ago. His cause died 64 years after him. But his ghost is still there, whispering in every succession crisis, every time someone thinks they deserve the throne more than the person sitting on it. They called him the Warrior King, the Black Dragon, the king who should have been. Maybe he should have been. Maybe he should have been. Maybe he shouldn't have. History made its choice. But somewhere, the sword Blackfyre might still exist. Somewhere, his ghost still whispers to ambitious men, and men still listen. 5 rebellions, 5 failures, and yet centuries later, people still argue about whether he was right. Maybe that's the only immortality anyone gets. Not winning, but making people think about your questions. Daemon failed, but his question remains. And as long as people wonder who really deserves to rule, his ghost will never die. The Black Dragon fell at Redgrass Field, but some fires never go out, no matter how much blood you pour on them. So tell me in the comments, Team Black Dragon or Team Red Dragon? Was Daemon right? And if you enjoyed this journey through one of Westeros's greatest tragedies, hit that subscribe button. The mysteries of Westeros are endless, and we're here to uncover every one. Until next time, remember, beneath the gold, the bitter steel, some dreams never die, and some ghosts haunt the world long after their bodies turn to dust.